So I'm here with Dr. Greg Fabiano, Associate Professor of Counseling, School, and Educational Psychology at the University of Buffalo. Dr. Fabiano will talk to us about timeout with children. So Dr. Fabiano, the first question I have is, what is timeout?
That's a good question. Timeout is really shorthand for a longer term timeout from positive reinforcement. So when we talk about timeout, we're talking about having a child go to a situation which isn't as fun or interesting or engaging, usually following a negative behavior, and they have to stay there for some time until they get back into the time in, which is the nice part of the day where they're interacting with people and people are catching them being good and encouraging them to be successful.
So why should a parent use timeout? Are there any benefits?
There's potentially lots of benefits of timeout. One is that it's a way to be really consistent as a parent. One of the challenges of parenting is that oftentimes a child does something that's negative, like they might be aggressive or they don't mind their parent or they might talk back. And a parent in that situation often ends up working on their heels. They have to react to that. If they have a timeout program set up ahead of time, they know what happens once that behavior is exhibited by the child knows what's coming, and it's a way to always stick with the same sort of consistent consequence. And through that, over time, you hope the child learns that maybe I shouldn't do those sorts of behaviors so that I stay out of this timeout situation.
So what are some tips that you have for parents who want to start using timeout as a strategy?
Well, one thing parents should think about is that timeout is actually one tool in a toolbox. So somebody that's just using timeout by itself might find that it's not as successful as it might be. Usually best recommendations are that timeout happens within the context of a really engaging environment. So that means that parents are catching kids being good when they do the right things. They're making sure that they're using good, clear, straightforward instructions that they know their child can follow through with. They're probably ignoring some of the minor things that kids might do that are annoying but not a really big deal. And really making sure that there's lots of naturally positive, rewarding things in the environment so that when timeout is implemented, it's a clear contrast from what the time in typically is.
So if a parent hasn't used timeout before and they'd like to start using it, what might be a good way to explain this procedure to your children?
There are a couple things to think about. So it's easy to say we're going to use timeout, but actually there's a lot of steps, right? So one thing parents should probably do is at a calm time, not in the moment when the child's having a hard time, sit down and explain to them how the timeout's going to work. And before they even do that, they probably have to think about what is our timeout going to look like. So there's lots of decisions. One thing parents have to decide is how long is this timeout going to last? The best evidence in the field suggests that short timeouts are just as good, if not better, than really long timeouts. So 3 or 4 or 5 minutes of timeout is typically enough to make an impression and have the child understand that that's probably not a behavior I should do again. And longer timeouts don't give you any more bang for the buck. So best recommendations are generally pretty short. Parents usually have to think about what location they're going to use for timeout. So if your child has a lot of toys and fun things in their bedroom, that's probably not the best place for a timeout, but a quiet area in the home or maybe the stairs or somewhere where there's not a whole lot of interesting things would be a good place to think about. And then parents might also want to try to plan ahead for what they're going to do if their child misbehaves when they get a timeout. These are usually typically very emotionally charged situations where the parent is upset that something happened. The child may have done something negative because they were upset. And so if there is going to be some negative behavior or negative feedback from the child, parents might want to think about, are they going to have a backup consequence, for example, that if a child doesn't follow through with the timeout plan, they might lose something even bigger. Or they might think about other things that they might do, like adding extra time onto a timeout or things like that.
And what if a parent says, I've used timeout before and it just hasn't worked?
That's a very common question, comes up a lot. And I think maybe one reason for that is that timeouts have to be given during perhaps the hardest parenting moments, right? It's when things aren't going well. And so one thing that is likely useful to think about is timeout is kind of a catch-all term for all sorts of things. And if what you're doing right now related to timeout isn't working, might mean that you just need to figure out how to tweak or change or modify the typical approach to timeout to make it more effective for the family. Just because the current way isn't working doesn't mean there's not another way that could maybe perhaps be more effective.
So what happens when kids get older? Can you still use timeout?
It's certainly hard to think about putting a 14-year-old in their room or something like that, right? They're big enough to tell you with their feet that they're not going to listen. As kids get older, their ability to think about consequences is also a bit more developed, relative to a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old. And parents at those ages might find privilege removal to be a more effective consequence. You're timing the child out, or the teen at that point, from positive reinforcement. But you can use more delayed consequences, like perhaps you can't use your phone or you can't get on the computer, or things that are very important to teenagers in terms of being interacted with their social network. With teenagers who are driving, you could take away the keys, you can ground them to the house, right, and not let them go out and be around their friends. But just like you would do for a timeout for a young child, those things are things you should discuss with the teenager ahead of time so they know exactly what the consequence is going to be. That allows them to make a good choice, right? If they know they really want to go out with some friends and the consequence of exhibiting a bad behavior is that they're going to miss out on going out with their friends, it might actually suppress whatever that behavior is, and everybody's happier.
Are there any other last tips that you'd want to give parents who want to try timeout with their kids?
I would say there's a couple things to think about. One is that when you try out timeout programs, behavior sometimes gets worse before it gets better. So if a child's used to kind of getting their own way or not minding a parent, and the parent all of a sudden decides we're going to really stick to our guns on this, you might see a child kind of reacts to that, and they may get a little worse. But if you stick with it and you're consistent as a parent, what you would expect would happen is that their behavior would get better over time. And so one bit of advice is to really keep with it and be consistent and give the program enough time to really make a dent. The other thing is that we think a lot about timeout because those are really challenging parenting situations, but we should be thinking just as much, if not more, about the time in. So those strategies I talked about before, like catching the kids being good, making sure that as parents we're attending to kids, that we're nurturing them, we're warm and attentive to them and interested in the things that they're doing. That's only going to make timeout more effective if it does have to be used because it's within that context of this overall warm, nurturing environment.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much.